Our passage for today is Ephesians 5, beginning at the first verse. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them. For you were once darkness, but you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It's shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes light. This is why it is said, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." So, like I said, there's a lot in this. So what I'm going to do is kind of break it apart and go through it kind of bit by bit this morning. But before we do that, I just want to take a step back and say, what is this helping us with? Well, I think it's helping us with an awful lot of things. But one of the things that it helps us with is a particular dilemma that we live with, which is oftentimes our attempts to do good and to improve the world often lead to greater problems. Our attempts to be righteous online just lead to far more heat than light. Rather than discovering truth, people form into tribes and turn against each other. And so you end up with more disunity, more discord, more exclusion. Think of a person who is a genuine and passionate feminist, really wants what is best for women, posts about it online and wants change, but then shops in Primark and unknowingly contributes to a system that actually greatly oppresses women and girls and keeps them in poverty. There's a book called When Helping Hurts, which kind of shines a light on the fact that many Christian missions around the world, coming from the first world to the third world, often end up doing more harm than good. Their literal best intentions, which these churches put an awful lot of money behind, can sometimes actually damage the communities they're trying to help. Or if you look at a secular example, in the 1960s, the world decided that everyone should be more liberated. And what this started to do was it kind of undermined marriage because, and that was genuinely seeking the welfare of people whose marriages were oppressive and damaging and difficult, and trying to liberate people who were being harmed by this thing they saw as a bad thing. But again, the research has backed up that the breakdown in marriage that's happened since the 1960s has disproportionately negatively affected the poor. Those who are worse off now get even more harmed by the fact that our society has tried to be a better place. In our attempts to make things better, we ended up making things worse. And this dynamic, I believe, is spoken to quite powerfully by our passage today. But the first thing I want to do for you as we attempt to digest an awful lot of good material is to kind of break down what is happening in this passage. So I've got a little graphic here, hopefully. Yes, I do. Here we go. Let me just pop this up for you. So what we're looking at here is the dynamic of this passage. Paul is writing about two distinct ways of life. One is light, the other is darkness, and breaks it down by kind of different areas. So first, the area of influence, how we become who we are and who we are influenced by. The way of light is to be to imitate God, and the way of darkness is to be influenced and imitate the world. When it comes to desire, the way of light is to worship God. The way of darkness is idolatry, that is to worship things or people or stuff, things that are not God. When it comes to conduct, the way of light is to pursue goodness. The way of darkness is to indulge our appetites. When it comes to speech, the way of light is to give thanks to God. The way of darkness is to talk trash, to talk all kinds of unprofitable and harmful things. When it comes to our attitude, the way of light is to sacrifice self. The way of darkness is to indulge self. When it comes to truth, the way of life is to expose evil. The way of darkness is to hide. When it comes to relationships or how we connect to other people, the way of light is to love people. The way of darkness is to use people. When it comes to the consequences of these ways of living, the way of light brings us alive and brings other people to life. The way of darkness leads to destruction. So what I'm going to do is go through that a little slower and try and make that into a bit of contemporary English for us, and kind of slow down on the ones that are kind of particularly important. So obviously the most important for today, and probably our focus, is this whole area of influence. Verses 1-2 say, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us." So the first step in this whole journey of lightness and darkness and these two ways of living is to become aware of influence and the power of imitation. Now, it's been said lots of times, and I couldn't find out who originally said it, but I've read it in lots of books and I've heard it lots of times, that you are the average of the 5 people closest to you. But what was interesting was when I went looking into who originally said that, I found an article by a behavioral scientist, a social scientist, looking into this effect. And essentially, he was saying that saying that you are the average of the 5 people closest to you. In fact, before I go into this, let me just explain what that means. What that is saying is we are not self-determined. We do not create ourselves, but rather we are deeply influenced by the people around us. So you start hanging out with bad characters, you will become bad like them. You start hanging out with people you admire and you think are great and you would like to become, you will become like them. So some people use this effect to change who they are. So they say, you know, I want to be like that person. And so they approach that person and say, can I spend some time with you? And it's actually in being around that person that you pick up everything about them and become more like them. So you can use this to your advantage, and those who are unaware of it can lose out. But basically, it's all about being aware of your influences and who's around you. So this saying comes out, you're the average of the 5 people closest to you. And then the social scientist comes along who's actually researched this and pulling together a few different studies and found that the power of this effect is even bigger than that. So they traced all different influential behaviors, and actually one of the easiest ones for them to follow was obesity, because you can put a number on that. And what they found was that if a friend of yours becomes obese, like starts to put on weight, you yourself are 45% more likely to gain weight over the next 2 to 4 years. But what was more surprising was they found that if a friend of yours becomes obese, your likelihood of gaining weight increases by about 20%. And that doesn't matter whether you know that other person or not. So this is how connected we are as human beings, that the behavior of a friend who you don't know has an influence on how you live. Sorry, how crazy is that? And that includes when you don't know that. And then they found it goes even further than that. So they found if a friend of the friend of your friend develops obesity, you're still 10% more likely than random chance to gain weight as well. So a friend of a friend of a friend gaining weight, can influence your own weight, which is absolutely nuts. That's how deeply connected we are as human beings. We are influenced massively by the people around us, and they're influenced by the people around them, which then passes on to us. And this is going to be really important for where we reach at the end of this talk. So hold on to this fact. But for now, the advice therefore comes in this passage. Therefore, do not be partners with them, talking about those who walk in the way of darkness. That's in verse 7. Now, this can easily be misunderstood that therefore, a Christian shouldn't have non-Christian friends, shouldn't be influenced by them, shouldn't be around them at all. But as we get towards the end of this passage, we see that's not at all what Paul is talking about. He actually wants Christians to be a good influence on the world. Therefore, they've got to have they've got to have those relationships in order to be a good influence on the world and people around them. What it's talking about is not to be partners with them in the ways of darkness. So when we look at the ways of darkness, which we'll get to soon, it's basically saying don't partner up with other people, so don't participate in those behaviors, don't do those things, don't look around at the world around you and join in, passively or impassively. And this is why, as a church, we have such a big focus on discipleship. So we do other things as well that really matter, but you are always being formed by someone or something. You are not neutral. Who you are becoming is always being formed. So it's very important to be aware of what those formational forces are around us, so that we can choose to not partner with them, not take part in those kind of things. And again, that's why when people get up here like me to talk through the Bible, we'll often point out cultural beliefs and things that we live around, because those things are really powerful. If we're not critical, if we're not aware, we will simply absorb the values and practices of the world around us. And Paul is being really clear here. It's like, when there is a way of life around us that's not of God, we do not partner in those things. We don't join in that activity. There are certain things where we should draw a line and say, I'm not going to join in that behavior. I can't be near that. I'm not going to do it. And that does not mean excluding non-Christian friends at all. In fact, if we do that, we can't do the rest of what this passage talks about. But it means we're not going to partner in those things that are not of God. And this kind of societal influence is further deepened in verse 6, where Paul says, let no one deceive you with empty words. So one form of influence is simply the people's values and behaviors who are around you. The way that they do things will directly and indirectly affect you unless you become aware of them and start partnering with God. The other form of influence is that, the way that the world behaves is often backed up with philosophy. So we'll go back to Ephesus. There were people whose literal job was kind of like talking head philosophers. They would talk about the way of life in culture and philosophy, and basically defend the way that the city was living. And there was an awful lot of things going on in Ephesus that a Christian could not take part in, many of which are not nameable right now. But these things were going on, and it wasn't enough that they were just going on. They were also justified. There was a lot of words heaped up. And basically what Paul is aware is that these kind of empty arguments, he calls them, can still be very persuasive. So there are behaviors and values around us in the world which are influencing us already, so we can become aware to them. But alongside that, there's also a lot of words floating around justifying those kind of behaviors. So there's a simple truth and fact in this, that what the majority buy into might not be what God is calling us to do as a people, and not what we're being asked to live as. And that has been the case throughout history. The Christian community in Ephesus lived very differently to the people around them. And, we should expect no different. We've not accidentally landed in the time in history where they've got it all right. But these behaviors and values often have some strong propaganda behind them, a lot of reasoning and arguments, and those things can be very persuasive as well. And so what we need to do is actually pick apart some of those arguments, look at them. Do they hold up? Do we believe that ourselves? And so actually, Christians should be amongst the most sharpened critical thinkers on earth. We should become more aware and more critical of what's going on, not in a critical spirit way, but just critical of behaviors, not assuming that they are inherently good or inherently right, but being aware of what's influencing, being aware of the propaganda behind that, and then paying attention to those things and seeing, is this of God or not? So, we're influenced by others' behavior and their values and the way they live. We're also influenced by the propaganda that goes with that. And we should not be following that behavior. The reason that Paul is writing this is because, he started this church. He's not been there for a few years. He's under house arrest. So the only thing he can do is write a letter to them. And he's obviously concerned that this small community in a big and enticing culture around them must be really tempted to go back to their old ways of life. There's probably things that they, enjoy doing that they would like to do again. There's probably things that their neighbors and their family are getting up to that, again, it's super awkward because they're not joining in those particular things, and it's creating friction and tension and rumors about them and all that kind of thing. But Paul is making clear, we do not get our morals and our values and our behavior from the majority or for the world around us, but only from God. And so you need to be alert to that and don't be tempted back into your own way of life. But it's not just about what we can't do, because that never works. Simply saying stop or don't or no is never enough. You need a replacement behavior, replacement values. And the advice given here is really simple. If you're going to imitate anyone, imitate God. If you're going to do things and look up to someone, look up to Jesus, look at his life. And, that's why, again, our thing is be with Jesus, become like Jesus, do what Jesus did, spend time with him, admire him. We become like the people we admire. That's what that's all about. We find something, really attractive in that person. And so we're drawn to them. And as we spend time with them, we become like them. And that's what we're talking about with Jesus. Spend a good amount of time with Jesus, imitate him, live the lifestyle that he lived, follow the teaching that he gave, and you will become the kind of person who pleases God. And when it says in verse 10, find out what pleases the Lord, what that means isn't, go through the Bible and underline everything that pleases God, although, that's a little bit of it. What it's saying something more deeper than that. Again, as I referred to last week, it's a lot like the start of Romans 12, the first two verses, which essentially say, be transformed in your thinking, in who you are, and you will naturally do the kind of things that please God. So you will both find the things, but also you will find them enjoyable yourself. Your tastes will change. What you enjoy will change. You will suddenly naturally do things that you didn't used to naturally do. And which brings us to our second contrast, which is the area of desire. So verse 5, for of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. What Paul is doing is he's linking the things that we want and the things that we worship with how we behave. And that was no radical thinking. Jewish people had known that for thousands of years. It's written all through the Old Testament. That God's problem with idolatry is not simply that, anyway, there are lots of problems with idolatry. One of them is how it affects who we are and how we treat other people. And it essentially goes like this. Idolatry, which sounds like it belongs to another time, is actually all about the heart. It's about the things that that brings us joy, that brings us pleasure, and where they sit in our hierarchy of loves. A well-ordered life, as St. Augustine wrote, would have God at the top of the list, or rather God surrounding the whole of the list. It puts God at the number one spot. What happens in idolatry is something supplants God at the top. whether that's a career performance or a relationship, or it can be absolutely anything. As soon as something tops God at the top of our list of desires and loves, our whole lives throw out of order. And Paul says here that greed is idolatry, because greed says, I have to have that thing. And as soon as you have to have that thing, then it has already supplanted God in your list. It's the thing that you worship, the thing that you have to have. This in itself is a massive subtopic, but it's essentially when you start loving things and needing to have them, you're not simply enjoying their good place within creation as God created it, but as soon as you have to have those things, they become a God. And here's the thing, is that idolatry is actually a very selfish orientation of life, because I have to have my needs fulfilled. So that, therefore I have to have this thing. You become very self-orientated and very distorted way of living. So someone who walks in the way of darkness has to have things, have to have whatever that thing is. Obviously in Ephesus, some of those things would have been literal idols. They had a famous goddess and a temple to that goddess in Ephesus, and people would have worshipped that. And in fact, there was a riot in the city because of the presence of Christians, because they didn't worship idols. But that same heart stance applies to pretty much anything. Anything can take the place of God. Anything can take that preference. And at which point, everything becomes distorted in our lives and affects things. But those who walk in the way of life, love God, imitate God, God fulfills their every need, and they don't need anything else more than they need God. So the next area is conduct. So as I've already started talking about, once our desires are orientated to the right place, then what next follows is right behavior. So verses 8-9, live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And so these are deliberately very broad virtues that basically cover any kind of good behavior and right thinking. Like all of it is covered here. And that's the idea, is like once we get our internal world in order with God at the top of the hierarchy, everything else falling in place underneath, then our behavior should flow out of that. So God is love, so therefore we start loving. God is truth, so therefore we speak in truth and live in the truth. God is good, and so therefore we live good lives. We've got this weird thing where we criticize people who try to live good lives. We call them holier than thou, and think they're taking things a bit too seriously, or that we assume they're judgmental in some kind of way. But Paul has no shame and finds no reason to apologize that he is living a holy life, that he is living a good life, and that he's unashamed in putting down bad living. He sees no problem in that. There's no problem in being sincere and wanting to live a good life, to have active concern for other people, to oppose greed. That's a good thing. And so Paul doesn't apologize for it, but instead encourages that our behavior overflow from that which we love. But in the way of darkness, he's got this big list of behaviors, some of which I can't go into right now because of little ears. But yeah, all kinds of things that flow from someone who is ultimately selfish, ultimately idolizing things and other stuff. So that's conduct. The next little area is speech. So verses 3-4, among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality, any kind of impurity, or any greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. So much like last week's passage, Paul talks about conduct, which we talked about, how we are to live as Christians, but he also talks about our speech. And that's because he knows, and the Bible knows, that speech is powerful. The very beginning of the Bible starts with God's words bringing the universe into creation. And when we speak, it affects reality. And there are these warnings throughout the Bible that we should be very careful about the things that leave our mouths, because they can bring life or they can bring destruction. They can bring unity and peace, or they can bring discord. Be aware of the words that you're putting out into the world, because they have effects, both good and bad. We and as I'm sure everyone else has at some point experienced the pain of lies being out there about us, rumors being spread, things being said, opinions being gossiped around. You've probably experienced it at some point where you've had a mistruth about you out there, or an opinion about there that you wouldn't agree with, or that's hurtful. And that has a destructive behavior on you. When lies get out there, which is one of the primary weapons of the devil in spiritual warfare, it creates discord, it creates disunity. That's why Paul is talking about light and darkness, because the things that we say should bring things to light. It should describe things as they are. It should build people up. It should bring unity. It should bring peace. And when they do the opposite of that, we're not living in the way of light, but rather we're bringing darkness into the world. And once again, Paul gives a replacement behavior. So rather than coarse talk and nasty talk and bad jokes and all that kind of thing, and gossip and all of these kinds of speech that bring up destruction, says instead, thank God. Use thanksgiving instead for the good things that God has done. Let the words that come out of your mouth be good words, wholesome words, words that build up. And then there's the next one is the difference in attitude between the way of light and the way of darkness. Verse 2 says, live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. And kind of the way I've distinguished this is like the way of light is the way of self-sacrifice, which is the way that Jesus went. The way of darkness is self-indulgence. It indulges every desire that comes to us again. So there's a big warning light there for our culture, which says, be true to yourself, follow your desires, which very much the opposite of the biblical advice is actually to be careful of some of the things that you want to do, because not every desire in you is good. Some of them will lead to yours and other people's destruction. Instead, true love looks like self-sacrifice. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus on the cross. Jesus had everything when he lived in heaven. He had all the love and security and praise and truth and light around him that he could ever need. But he chose to leave that world of light and enter our world of darkness. He lived our life. He trained up disciples, but at the end, nearly all of them had abandoned him, and he was left alone on the cross, rejected, having done absolutely nothing wrong. But from the cross, which he chose to walk towards, you find him loving and forgiving people at this greatest moment of his personal rejection. There is no escaping that to truly love other people, it will require varying degrees of self-sacrifice. Whereas the way of darkness, the way of the world that Paul is describing, is self-indulgent, fulfills its own desires, cares primarily about self. But in order to love people, we need to follow the example of Jesus. So the next one is to do with truth, which we've already touched on a great deal. But again, this is one of the big distinctions in this passage. So the way of light likes to know how things truly are, likes to bring truth to situations, to see how things are actually as they are. And the way of darkness would hide things, is ashamed, hides things away. So verses 11 through 13 have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It's shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. So, as the secular world has already discovered, transparency is a good thing. When you have a dysfunctional family or organization, it generally helps to bring to light everything that's actually going on, rather than keep it all hidden. When there's a lot of secrecy in an organization, that's when bad things can happen and can run rife because no one knows what's going on. And so it's all hidden. People have a sense that things are going wrong, but have no idea why, because everything is hidden. And what Paul is arguing for, it's much, much bigger than transparency, but at least part of it is saying, essentially, there should be nothing hidden. There should be nothing we cannot look at and talk about and expose to the light of God. Because within ourselves and within the wider culture, in every human community, from families to friends to workplaces, there's always a monster or two lurking somewhere around. And that includes within ourselves. And because there's always a monster somewhere, we need to be diligent at bringing those things to light, naming the elephants in the room, talking about the things that are going wrong rather than hiding them. Because when things that are going wrong get hidden, they grow. They don't go away. They get worse. And we know this as human beings. When we do something we're ashamed of, something bad, we hide them from other people, and sometimes significantly from ourselves. We do our own little PR work. I needed that, or that was necessary, or it's okay because of ... And do our own little hiding even from ourselves when we do something wrong. There is a conscience that God gave us, and a lot of the time we already know when we're doing the wrong thing, and when we do that, we tend to hide it. And so on a personal level, one of the most important Christian disciplines for growth is confession. There is nothing in my life that is hidden away, and that is not broadcast from the rooftops, but that's rather done with one or two or three very close friends who you admire, who have good character, who you can trust, who you can divulge everything to. There should be nothing in your life that no one knows. There should be some people you can trust enough that you can divulge everything. And then what often happens is healing will come because light has been shone in that place. And once healing has come, those wounds become scars and often become places of strength. Something that you might be struggling with personally, or within a relationship that's currently all hidden up. If it's brought to the light, discussed, dealt with well, with God's light on it, those things can often become places of strength, which is why Christian speakers are sometimes the mature ones, the ones who are most shockingly open about things they've got wrong in the past, because they've been through a healing journey with those things. They're no longer ashamed. They've dealt with it. They've moved on, and that thing that was a weakness has now become a strength. But what Paul is talking about, and this is really important here, is not exposing people, but exposing deeds. We're talking about values and behaviors and things, and not the people themselves. So to expose people could be public shaming. To expose behaviors and deeds is saying that you can change, we can change, I can change. So Paul is not here about getting on Facebook and going, such and such, I did this thing and whatever, but rather like talking about what's actually going to lead to good living here, what's actually going to make the world a better place, and dealing with that thing, bringing it to light, bringing the life of God on it, not shaming individuals. So it's, if you could imagine a set of behaviors that someone's doing, what we're not saying is you're a bad person. We're saying that's not a great way of living. Is there a better way of living? What would God say to that behavior? Because that says that that person can change. We're not here to shame, to add to the sense of needing to hide, but actually to remove it. But that takes an awful lot of moral courage to be able to walk in the light, hold to truth and love. Is incredibly difficult. I'm not going to pretend it's anything else, and it's not going to make you loads of friends, but it is the thing that's going to bring most healing in the long term. So the final two, relationships and consequences. So from verse 2, live a life of love. One of the main bits of instruction in this is to live in light and love. Live a life of love, or a different way of translating that is to adopt a lifestyle of love. Let love define how you live so much that it can be described as your lifestyle. And in its broader sense, this is all about seeking the good of others. If we go back to the attitude of the way of darkness, when you have to have things and you're fulfilling selfish desires, when you're living in that way, you are not going to self-sacrificially love other people. You're not going to self-sacrificially seek the good of other people, but you are going to end up using people for your own ends, because that way is ultimately self-centered and self-focused. But the way of love, again, requires right ordering. It requires self-sacrifice. But that is how we can walk in the way of love. But with it is this amazing promise, which brings us to our final point, which is the consequences of living in light and living in darkness. If we live in light, verse 13 says, everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated itself becomes a light. So as I was hinting at before, what Paul is encouraging us to do as Christians is not to withdraw from society and keep ourselves pure, but rather to shine a bright light in the midst of the world in order that the world can be healed. Because light brings growth, light brings healing, light burns away all of those unhealthy things that thrive in darkness. Light heals the world. So rather than, be prudish and waggy fingered and judgmental about all this terrible things going on in the world, instead, we're encouraged to not be influenced by ourselves and not to partner in that behavior, but rather to live a different and radical life in the midst of our communities in order that light is brought onto those behaviors to show them up for what they are, which is fruitless, it says. They achieve nothing good. And that's the thing. It's ultimately the way of darkness is the way of destruction. In verse 6, it says, because of such things, that long list of bad behaviors, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Now, God's wrath is much misunderstood. People instinctively hear that as God is judgmental and angry, and when he finally loses his temper, he's going to lash out at me. That is not at all what wrath is, but wrath speaks to this tension at the heart of reality, which is that God is a good and a loving God who created a good world which is supposed to run on love and truth and is supposed to function like that. But the good creation he made rebelled against him, chose their own way, indulged their own appetites rather than be selfless, sought their own things and worshipped things other than God, and threw the whole thing into chaos. But God loves his creation still, and so he loves the ones who are being disobedient towards him. And that is why he creates a new way through Jesus. And through Jesus, the church is born, and the church is supposed to live in the same attitude as Jesus towards everyone else, calling people to the light, because the way of darkness, the way that is not of God, leads to destruction in two ways. The first way is that wrath, the wrath of God, which is the part of God which is good and loving, has to burn against everything that is wrong. It has to burn against injustice. It has to burn against unrighteousness. It has to burn against evil, because God is good and loving. So part of that is built into creation itself. That is, God made the world to function in a certain way. And when we leave that way, there are negative consequences for us and for others. That is part of wrath. It is built into the creation that God made. The other part is that the end of time is eventually going to come. Jesus will return and establish full rule on earth. And at that point, all of those who have chosen to live in disobedience to him no longer fit or belong to this good creation that God has created, but they have chosen the way of darkness. They've chosen to go against God. So we're not talking about God, writing up a list and saying if you've ever fallen short. We're talking about broad directions of life. And when you've chosen the way of darkness and disobedience, that comes with consequences. So again, this isn't necessarily a teaching or an instruction. It's more describing how reality is. If you live in the way of destruction, you will be destroyed. If you live in the way of life and light, you will have life and light. It's just natural consequences. This is how reality is. So pick the right way. And ultimately, God is a loving Father who creates for us a lighted space for us to grow and to bear fruit. He creates light so that we might grow, that we might change. He's not angry. He's calling us home to him. It's not a threat. It's an invitation. So to go back to our original point, why is it that often our attempts to do good end up doing more harm? I believe one of the big things that this passage teaches us is that righteousness and justice are inseparable. So I'd say that right now we live in a culture that loves justice. It loves helping other people. It loves going out and being seen to be doing good things. It's all about the external, but it's quite sniffy and suspicious of anyone who is pursuing goodness and a righteous life. That seems old-fashioned. It looks like it belongs to a different age. And the only righteousness that we know anymore is belonging to the right team and putting the right slogans on social media and so forth. What the Bible knows is that righteousness and justice are inseparable. We cannot do good in the world unless we are being transformed into God's likeness ourselves. We cannot be putting other things above God and be able to do good in the world at the same time. Ultimately, that leads to destruction. And so in order to be able to do good in the world, we need things like worship. We need things like giving thanks to God. We need to be imitating God. We need to, in short, be with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and do what Jesus did. Otherwise, our actions are disordered. They're coming from dangerous and unhealthy places.